Make sure you're paying attention to how customers actually behave as opposed to what they say they're going to do.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
I mean, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the intricate relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving, and today our guest is Scott Francis. Here are 3 things you want to know about Scott before we start. He founded his own pricing consulting firm called Strategic Pricing Solutions 13 years ago, and he's still feeding his family doing that. Before that, he was VP of Finance at Fisher Scientific, who moved into VP of Marketing. I have a feeling we're going to ask some questions about that. And then finally, he writes a very thoughtful blog, which I read every single week. Sometimes I even send him a note telling him how much I like the most recent one. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Mark. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you. So let's start off with this big transition. How do you go from CFO, VP of Finance to VP of Marketing?
Well, actually, that's an interesting question. And one of the things that was the key to it is I had always had responsibility for pricing. And as the VP of Finance, I had the responsibility for pricing. We created a new strategic pricing function within the organization and did very well with it. And then, the company offered to expand my role into marketing. That said, there's a little bit of nervousness that happens with it because it is different functionally. In both cases, you're trying to improve the profitability of the company. But, as the VP of Finance, oftentimes your role is to make sure the company doesn't go too fast and doesn't take too much risk. And as the VP of Marketing, if you're not finding the edges where the risk gets a little bit nervous, then you're probably not doing enough. So it was a little bit nerve-wracking in that initial part of the transition. But I learned my way through it and enjoyed it quite a bit.
It was nerve-wracking in the sense that you had to make a mental transition. Is that it?
Exactly.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay. I teach pricing all the time, and I tell people never let finance control pricing. Is that the wrong thing to be saying?
Well, that's interesting. So clients ask that question all the time, is where should pricing reside? And my answer is it can reside in marketing. It can reside in finance. It can be its own function, reporting up to the COO. Probably the only place I don't recommend pricing residing is in sales. My rationale for that is even in finance, although financial folks, as I said, are trying to limit how much risk the organization takes on. Pricing ultimately has a very data-driven component to it, and the finance people are good at that. And finance people are trained to be objective about things as opposed to, having their particular biases. And so as long as you have the right people in the finance organization who have the data orientation and can think strategically and, can at least understand how they need to stretch to be able to capture new businesses, I think it works fine. If the finance organization tends to be very reporting oriented only and sort of, the accounting bias to it, then it probably won't work real well. I would say you don't have to continue to tell people not having it in finance.
Well, let me explain why. And I actually like sales more than finance, but let's have a quick conversation about that.
Sure.
I always teach value-based pricing, and I assume that's what you talk about too. Let's charge what our customers are willing to pay. And yet, who in our company understands value? It's almost always product management, product marketing, and that's where I really want pricing to be. And then salespeople actually understand value, but I'm really nervous about letting them have pricing because they have this incentive to not try to capture it all. And finance people, I love finance people in the sense that they're so smart, they care so much, but they don't know the value of our products. What do you think of that?
Well, so I think that's a good point. The finance people don't necessarily know the value of the products, and their job isn't necessarily, if they're in charge of pricing, isn't necessarily the ones to determine what that value is. Their job is to put the the processes in place so that the organization is actually thinking about what the value is, identifying it, and pricing according to that value. But finance doesn't need to be the one figuring out what that is. They need to be the ones, in that case, controlling the process and making sure that there's a rigorous, disciplined approach to it.
Yeah, I think that comes back to the really hard question, and that is who should own pricing? And the answer to that is always way more than one person, one department.
Completely agree.
So pricing is so much bigger than just, hey, I got to put a price on this product at the end. And to let finance control the process, monitor the process, guide the process makes a lot of sense.
Do you want to talk just a second about having it in the sales organization?
Yeah, let's do that. What's your opinion? By the way, I'm not a fan, but what's your opinion?
Well, so you are right that the sales folks are the most, maybe not the most, but they are closer to the customers and they have a better chance of being able to, customer by customer, figure out what the value is. But you're also right when you say they have an incentive to sell, and that sometimes causes them maybe not to capture all the value. And so one of the things that we've done for a few clients is we've, as a part of the work with them, we've surveyed how the salespeople think about things, and we've asked salespeople the question: if you have a chance to have, you can take a bet where you get 80% chance you're going to win $500 and a 20% chance you're going to get zero, or you can have $350 guaranteed. Which one would you take? And what we find is, at least 2/3 of the time, the sales folks take the guaranteed money. Well, from your statistics class, that's a bad bet. The expected value is higher on the 80-20 opportunity. And then we ask them the opposite. Take the same bet, 80% chance you're going to lose 500, 20% chance you lose nothing versus a guaranteed loss of 350. Interestingly enough, then they take the 80-20 bet. And again, that their expected loss is actually worse than their expected gain. And so I go through all that really to find out that the sales folks are risk averse. And so that point you made about them having incentive to not capture all the value is because they don't want it to go to zero. They tend to be risk averse. And so, you end up maybe leaving money on the table when you don't need to.
I certainly agree that that's part of it. I think the other part is salespeople are going to use every lever that they have available to them to try to close a deal. And when you give them price as one of the levers, they're going to use it.
Fair enough.
What's one big problem you often see when you get involved with pricing at companies besides sales?
Well, I guess one of the other big problems that we come across is companies think they're using their data to drive pricing decisions. And what they're really doing is using aggregated average data. And so they'll see, an average number, maybe ASP, average sale price, went down, or maybe they see that aggregate, margin went down for some reason. And their conclusion often is it's being caused by price. They conclude that without actually going through enough layers of detail to understand, is this a broad-based issue that we're having, or is it, really focused in one particular area and we don't need to make rash decisions? So that rigor and discipline of doing things at a more granular level is, one of the earliest things we always have to tackle in any company that we work with.
That ASP number is an exciting, interesting number, but it really does just give you a very broad brush. It could be different market segments, different geographies. It could be different products. You have no idea the product mix that we're selling. That's just an indicator that something's changing. Now let's go figure out what's changing.
Completely agree.
I apologize. I read a blog not too long ago about the iPhone pricing in China. Was that one yours?
I did write a blog that referenced iPhone pricing in China.
Okay.
So it could have been mine, maybe another one.
Let's assume it was yours for a second. And when you talked about ASP, the blog I'm thinking of essentially said, okay, Apple's ASP are down, but that's really because of a single geography. And that's China.
Yes.
If you look everywhere else, that's not the case.
That's right. And yes, I did write about that. And, one of the things that had been said to me, and actually also I read a couple of things, is, they got their pricing strategy wrong and they don't understand elasticity and customers won't pay that much. But in fact, it was a much more localized problem related to China and India than to the rest of the world. So yes.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. And so where do you find ASPs going down? Where do you find the surprising answer to that? ASPs going down, you're going to dig into the data. You want to understand why. What surprises you?
Well, I mean, I think it could be a variety of things. So oftentimes, I'll give you an example. One time we found a case where the ASP was going down. And there were two big drivers of that. One was they had a number of huge customers who brought them very large books of business. And for that, those customers, received a pretty substantial discount on the things that they were buying. And we have no qualms with doing those kinds of things, right? So large books of business often do get discounted prices. It's certainly cheaper for you to manage getting orders in one big shot. It's cheap, you don't have to have customers who are making a buying decision many times. They're making that decision one time. So no issue with that. And if you then looked at the rest of their customers who weren't those very large ones, they actually had price increases. And so that's the kind of thing that we see customers or clients may react negatively to, say, oh, ASP went down, but really it's because of a good decision they made, big customers, a lot of incremental volume, and their overall margin went up.
Yeah. So they make good business decisions, and yet this one metric that they're watching, oh no, that's going down. What's the problem? What's the process you go through? Someone comes to you and says, hey, Scott, ASPs are down. Help us figure this out. What do you do?
Well, we start by saying, let's take a look at what data you're looking at that show you that. Then whether we'll look at, what level of aggregation is that data? We'll typically, from that come up with a number of questions that require them to dig a little bit deeper. And those questions are usually pointed at identifying, at what level is the problem being generated, and can we identify specific segments or geographies or something. For some of our clients, they find that difficult to do. And if they've got a lot of data, or they don't, they're typically doing things only in Excel and they find it difficult to get at a granular level, then we'll do it for them. But most clients have the capability to do things at a granular level. They're just not used to doing so. So we get them going in that process.
Yeah. And you have to think about it. Someone says to you, ASP is going down. When do you step back and say, well, it could be big customers versus small customers? I mean, that's what you have to think of in order to go check the data.
They should be doing that as a matter of course of all the things. So, one of the things, your question that kind of reminded me, one of the things that we like to do is talk with the customers about, okay, well, what are the circumstances under which you think you should sell at a lower price, or, that you do sell at lower prices? Let's just describe a few of those circumstances. Similarly, what are the circumstances under which you try to capture higher prices? Let's describe some of those. And then once we have a reasonable set of those types of circumstances, we now say, okay, now let's look at your data for each of these different situations or different types of circumstances. Are you experiencing ASPs in each, declining ASPs in each of those, or are you seeing that they're fairly steady, or, what are the actual results? So that is one process we use to kind of get them to think about it in that way.
Fabulous answer. The whole point is, tell us what your intentions are. What do you think should be happening? And now let's put the analytics together to go figure it out. Is that actually what's happening or not? Beautiful. Exactly. This whole question of which KPIs to watch always seems like a challenging one, because there's so many KPIs that we could be tracking nowadays. Do you teach clients, or do you help them figure out this is the right set to be watching, and we watch them monthly, quarterly? What's your thought on that?
Well, so we do work with clients to figure out what the right KPIs are for their particular business and situation. Our view is, at a minimum, you want to look at these things monthly. To the extent that you can create reporting tools and dashboards that let you see the information and the results more frequently, that's better, because then you can react a little bit more frequently. But we work with them to really identify what are the significant drivers of value or significant drivers of customer decisions within their business, and then try to build the KPIs around them. Again, let me give you an example. Customers get a quote before they buy every time, or most of the time. In other businesses, customers just show up and they buy. They don't ask for a quote or an estimated price. So when they do have quotes or estimates before they buy, we want to look at how often do you win when you give those estimates, right? That's not something we would give, but we would come up with as a KPI for a company that rarely gives quotes, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. There's such a thing as a win-loss ratio if we're quoting business, but if I'm not quoting business, how do I know that somebody came and looked at me and didn't buy?
Exactly.
So we don't have the win-loss ratio. Yeah. You mentioned a second ago what's driving value. And I have just been fascinated with this concept of pricing models and all of the subscription pricing models. Have you been involved with that at all?
Well, subscription models, not technology subscription models, but in other avenues, a little bit. More of our effort has been around product and service pricing. And then there have been a few cases where subscriptions are a part of that.
Can you tell us about one? You don't have to name the company, but I'd love to hear about subscription, especially for hardware products.
I guess I would describe it more as the consumables that go along with hardware products. This was a client who sold large instruments and instrumentation. And to use those, their customers could buy, the customers went through a lot of consumable things to use their instruments and instrumentation. And they could buy those consumables anywhere. And so we actually came up with a couple of different approaches to it. So one was I would describe it as a by the usage pricing mechanism. So let's say you're going to use this particular instrument 1,000 times a month, 12,000 times a year. We can come up with a price that includes consumables and the instrument. So it's kind of a subscription to the instrument itself that is on a per usage basis. And we can put enough boundaries around it so that it works for the client and for us. And then so they're really locked into it. At that point, they're kind of locked into your ecosystem. Another option was, you buy the instrument or the instrumentation, and we're going to create a schedule of regular consumables. So you've got a very clear idea of what you're going to get on a regular basis, and we've got a very clear idea of what the orders are. And for that, there's this monthly price, a monthly subscription to those consumables. And then the third option was, you buy it by the drink, you order it as you need these things, and you're free to order from somebody else at any time. And our view is when they're, in that case where they can go multiple places, some places are stickier than others, but in that case where it's somewhat easy for them to switch these types of things, there's a value to the selling entity, our client, of having a regular ongoing purchase, and that your customer is not having to make a new purchase decision every month or every period that they need this stuff. There's a value to us of having that and having a certainty of production and the revenue stream. And so we create a package around that.
Oh, that was brilliant. So I love the first one, which says pay by the usage. Now, obviously, we're not charging them per use, but there's some subscription that says, hey, you're going to use it 100 times a month, and here's the fee, and we can fulfill the consumables that way.
That's right.
And so that one is almost a no-brainer subscription one. The thing I really like about the second one is, although the client could go elsewhere, because we have them on a subscription, they really don't make that decision again. They just make the same decision month after month after month.
That's right.
I think that's brilliant. I read a paper once about raising prices on subscriptions. And the thing that just fascinated me about this was, if you were to raise the price by, say, 1 penny, what you do is you cause somebody to rethink their decision. Where if you don't change the price, they just write the check every month. And that's essentially what you're doing with that second tier.
That's true. A lot of that ultimately then depends on how much pricing power they have. I mean, so if you think about the example you just gave, then you apply that to Netflix, who just, raised their price $2, almost 20%. in many instances, that would be very difficult because, as you said, you've now caused every customer to rethink that decision.
Yep.
Am I going to do this or not? In Netflix's case, the customers are so locked into that ecosystem, the vast majority are going to pay the extra $2 and keep going.
Yeah, and it's a good value. I can almost guarantee you they lost some clients when they did that.
Oh, no doubt.
And it's not people who said, oh, it's not worth $2 more. It's actually people who said, it's really not worth the $12 I was paying, but I never rethought the decision.
Right. I think that's a very insightful observation there.
This has just been fun. Last big question for you. What's one piece of pricing advice that you could give to our listeners that you think might have a big impact?
That's an interesting question. So the way I guess I would answer that is make sure you're paying attention to how customers actually behave as opposed to what they say they're going to do. And so what I mean by that is we bluff sometimes. We all say higher price, lower volume. You raise the price, I'm gonna really look at things. And that causes fear in organizations around raising prices. If you pay attention to how customers actually behave when, pricing choices are in front of them, you'll have a much better understanding about how much pricing power you really have and how sensitive your customers really are, and you can make much better decisions than just listening to what the customers say via survey or what the salespeople tell you they've said. That's my best advice.
So I'm going to summarize that. If you can, use real sales data.
That's a good way to summarize it.
Not that surveys aren't valuable, but boy, that data, the real live behavior sales data, super valuable.
Exactly.
Yeah. Scott, thank you so much for your time today. If anyone wants to contact you, how can they do that?
Our phone number is 412-222-9522. So that's a lot of twos for strategic pricing solutions.
Yes.
You can reach me by email at sfrancis@stratpricing.com. And Mark, thanks very much for having me. It's been fun.
Oh, thank you, Scott. I've had a great time. I'm so glad you're here. And to our listeners, I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. We've now made it through episode 5. And we have a ton more great guests coming in the future. If you got value out of this podcast, would you please tell your friends about it? Like us on however you subscribe to the podcast. It'll really help us out. Also, any compliments, suggestions, or questions can always be sent to me directly, mark@impactpricing.com. Finally, please join us next week for a new episode of Impact Pricing.